Hi guys, hold on for a second. Before we proceed to the video, I have something very important to tell you. Professor John Vicofus has published his new book in collaboration with Little French Media, and the title of the book is Neoliberalism, Inequality, and Authoritarianism. This book details how neoliberalism impacts the geopolitical economy in the 21st century. You can buy it from Amazon and the link is in the description. Thank you. Now let's proceed to the video.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to a session on inequality and exploitation from Plato to neoliberalism in the 21st century. I want to begin by pointing out that this is a topic that has preoccupied philosophers, theologians, as we will see, and those are the two domains that I'm going to focus on, of course, in a two-part session. This is part one, but also other fields, especially from the 19th century on, everyone from anthropology and psychology, political science, sociology, and so forth. Uh, Inequality and exploitation is a very serious matter. And before defining the terms, and it's very important to do so, let me point out that in our time, in the era of neoliberal globalization, although that model is rapidly diluting owing to the, in large measure, the G7 group uh, intensely competing with China and trying its very best to slow down at least its rapid ascendancy to the number one global economic status. And that has had consequences in terms of sanctions and tariffs, which of course create pricing pressure, which then filters down and it impacts living standards, hence greater inequality. That's a very brief explanation. Now, the fact is that inequality has been rising because of the complex impact of the neoliberal model, which has become the norm on a world scale with nuances in different countries, more so in the Western countries and Japan, less so. For example, in China and some of the countries which opt for quasi-statist routes, that is, the government still having a major role in managing private capital and um, persisting and insisting on social development to mitigate the rising inequality. Inequality is very important, obviously, as we will see, because from ancient times to the present, um, partly because all human beings have a sense of inequality, and immediately when you ask the layperson out there, what is that? What image is evoked in your mind when you hear the term inequality? They reply unfairness. And in literature and in public opinion polls that have been conducted, that is in fact the term that the common person uses. It really goes beyond that. And the ultimate form of inequality, obviously, from the ancient times until the abolition of slavery as an institution, especially in the United States, but also in other countries like Brazil, in the 19th century, the ultimate form of inequality is obviously to have a slave-based economy, at least part of the economy, uh, based on slave labor. And like I said, from ancient times through the ages, serfs were um, the counterpart to the slaves. Serfs, one step above, I suppose, slaves throughout the medieval period, and we'll make references to them as well. But the fact is that inequality also applies to gender. Inequality applies to gender as throughout the ages, from the beginning of civilization uh, to the present, regardless of whether it's in Asia. And we'll look very briefly at how Confucianism contributed to the patriarchal society in China, for example. Um, Hinduism in India. So, and Christianity in the West. Okay. Um, Now, the term inequality and, of course, exploitation, because I'm going to be talking about those two that go together. This is not about human beings being different, because all human beings, we take it for granted that all human beings are indeed different. They're not the same. Um, Different shapes, different colors, different talents, above all, different talents, different physical abilities, different intellectual abilities. So we have differences. This is not what we're talking about when we're talking about inequality. What we are talking about is what happens with the beginning of civilization 3,500 years ago, 3,500 BC rather, 5,500 years ago, when the first civilization in Sumeria, modern day Iraq, emerges. From there on to the present, we have had institutional inequality which becomes the norm because it's legislated and it becomes policy. And we'll see, for example, in specific cases, because we will begin with Plato and Aristotle in Athens, late 5th century, early 4th century, during the decline of Athens, of Athenian democracy, and the decline of classical Greek civilization. And we'll take that all the way up to Martin Luther, by the way. We are going to end this part one with Martin Luther. Part two begins with a contemporary of Martin Luther, also a German theologian, whose name is Thomas Müntzer. Now, I want to point out that institutionalized inequality necessarily implies that there is a group of people, invariably throughout history, the majority, that suffer marginalization within the institutional structure, and there is a tiny minority that derives the benefits as a result of inequality. Now, human beings come up with all kinds of justifications, and they try to rationalize their way out of why some people are inferior. As we'll see, Aristotle firmly believed in the inferiority of women, for example. Both Plato and Aristotle believe in the inferiority of slaves. We will look at these issues. The question, of course, is this something that is innate in human beings? Are human beings born with innate propensities toward a predisposition for inequality, to treat others as unequal, or is this learned behavior? This is an issue that was in fact examined as early as the 17th century by English philosopher John Locke, and then Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the French philosopher, in the 18th century went deeper into this issue. And of course, on down in the 19th century, with various intellectuals looking into this issue of whether human beings have an innate tendency, and some even used Darwinism, in subverting Darwin's theory of evolution, for example, to create social Darwinism, which is a racist theory, by the way, to justify, in the age of European Western wide, I should say, imperialism, the Western domination, the Western hegemony of the global South, Africa, parts of Asia, and Latin America. So human beings create ideologies and create all sorts of justifications of why some people are superior to others, and use that to exploit them. The question is, let us assume that nature did not endow all human beings to be equal, as it has not, physically or intellectually or in any way, shape, or form. Does this mean that skin color or physical shape or gender or any cultural trait, religion, for example, which is part of culture, should that be used as a justification to exploit that individual? Skin color was used from the Portuguese arrival in Northwest Africa and the beginning of the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade. And you have millions, by the way, scholars disagree on how many millions of Africans were transported from the continent to the Western Hemisphere to be slave labor. And in the name of Jesus Christ, because they were of different color, because the Europeans decided they were inferior, unequal to the Europeans. Europeans had a Eurocentric worldview. Europe was the standard for civilization. As we'll see, all of this goes back to the classical world, and it's transferred on, it's passed on to the Western world. So what we have with inequality is inexorably followed by exploitation. Inequality is used to exploit. How do we mean this? Exploit labor, the slave labor issue from ancient times until the 19th century is a very obvious example. But the gender issue is another one, okay? Inequality between men and women. Then the inequality of the working class, which with the Industrial Revolution of England becomes much and much more uh, wider spread throughout the Western world and Japan eventually by the 19th century, the rise of the working class, discriminated against, assumed to be in that state because it's their own fault. If they're poor, it's not because they're treated, because of policy, government policy, which is exactly why inequality exists, by the way, because the fiscal system can really take care of inequality, socioeconomic inequality. Let me point out one more statistic and then we'll go on um, to Plato. The um, the world today has 8 billion people. Clearly, it's not an equal world. You can look at any statistics, whether it's from the United Nations, the ILO, the International Labor Office, the World Bank, the Pew Research Center, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International. It doesn't matter what you look, any organization. And what you find is inequality on a world scale, geographic by geographic regions, and obviously we know which is the poorest continent, namely Africa, and then social class. Okay, uh, the working class, especially manual workers, untrained workers, um, and in this age when everybody in business circles is excited about artificial intelligence as well as governments. There is a fear that we will have even greater inequality. So, in this age, right now and down the road, artificial intelligence, taken very seriously, by the way, by governments, by some governments, for example, in Europe, they could take it a little bit more seriously than they do in the US and Canada. Um, and they are concerned. What will this mean? Now, one reason they're concerned is because much of Europe today in 2024, much of Europe has rising right-wing parties, far right-wing parties, neo-fascist parties, and they're against migrants. And those migrants come from Africa and Asia, and they don't want them. And one of the concerns they have about artificial intelligence, what happens to all these people is they flood Europe. They will dilute the purity of Europe as though it were ever pure. In any case, um, the let me return to one statistic of just the glaring inequality that exists on the planet. 1% of the world's population, 1% of the world's 8 billion people own more wealth than the bottom 90%. 4 billion of the 8 billion people on the planet today earn less than 550 a day. This is today. This is at a time that there are corporate CEOs and mega investors who have billions, the government is not stepping in to rectify the situation, this huge inequality in incomes, and rather allows, it permits the consequences of inequality and exploitation, which are people living on the edge of starvation throughout the planet, by the way. This includes the United States, which has a rising inequality in the last 40 years, not just now, since the COVID-19 breakout in 2020, by the way. Rising homelessness. So we have rising poverty levels. You would be astounded when you look at the poverty level in some countries. Let's just take China. China actually a few years ago eliminated extreme poverty, and it now is pushing social development to the point where it's trying to raise living standards higher and higher so that people are well comfortably above the poverty line. This is not happening, not just in the Western countries in the G7. It's not happening in India, and India has phenomenal GDP growth, by the way. India fancies itself as the next China. This is true. But it doesn't have the social development component, hence inequality. And of course, the state using Hinduism, and we'll talk about that too, to distract from the inequality reality and exploitation, is deliberate because it allows the state to continue to perpetuate inequality and throw capital at the very few people, this tiny percentage who are billionaires and multimillionaires. I want to be one other thing I lied. Yes, I'm not going to talk about Plato. In just a minute I will. I want to, before I start with Plato, I want to point out that very few philosophers and theologians and scholars of every domain throughout history have ever taken pride in celebrating inequality and exploitation. No one has done that. Niccolo Machiavelli, the 15th century Italian political thinker, came close, very fiendishly, if you will, to sort of doing that. But he actually did not celebrate, and actually Niccolo Machiavelli, in his ideal mind, would have preferred the republican form of government as the ideal, although in The Prince, the book that everybody is familiar with and associates with Machiavelli, everybody who has studied Machiavelli associates Machiavelli with The Prince, his most important work. There he clearly believes in an authoritarian type of regime, and we'll talk about Niccolo Machiavelli. But really, even not Machiavelli came as to the degree that neoliberal thinkers, and in part two, I discuss two of them, Friedrich Hayek, the Austrian political economist, and his student, Milton Friedman, University of Chicago professor, who won the Nobel Prize for writing a book on advocating the neoliberal model, which neoliberal model celebrates inequality and exploitation. And it doesn't use those terms, by the way. Instead, it uses the euphemism freedom, free to choose, free from any kind of restrictive conditions by the state, and the role of the state should be there to support capital accumulation and the wealthy, the capitalist class, the wealthy people, to accumulate at whose expense? And toward what goal? What would be the goal here? Certainly not social harmony. Social harmony here is not the goal. And so let's begin. Again, that's in the second segment. Let me begin with Plato. Plato lived in Athens when Athens was in decline. Athens was experiencing decline in the late 5th century because of a 30-year war that it had, a little bit longer. A war that there was a major war between Athens and Sparta, the allies of Athens against Sparta, which basically dragged all of the Greek city-states into this conflict. And this marks the end of civilization. Technically, you have Athens. No matter who claims they won, and Athens claim, of course, did. But the fact is, there were no winners. Everybody was a loser in this because it was a war of attrition. They simply degenerated all the resources. They used up all the resources. And Plato lived during that period. He was a young man during that period. He was growing up during that period. Plato was an aristocrat, by the way. He was aristocrats. There was no public education. As an aristocrat, he had the money. His family had the money to educate him. So he was educated. He is considered the towering philosopher. When I was a philosophy and history, a double major in Chicago in philosophy and history, there was no way you could escape not taking a course on Plato and go on. Plato and Aristotle you had to take, then you take other courses. Then you go to Jean-Paul Sartre and Friedrich Nietzsche. But first Plato and Aristotle. Anyway, Plato is indeed a philosopher who made monumental, far-reaching contributions to the study of philosophy. In his most important work, The Republic, he presents a utopian vision of society. The word utopia is Greek, and it means no place, meaning the ideal place. Plato could not see how the form of government he advocated would come to fruition, it would become a reality. He recognized that. And so he concocted this, he develops this vision of the ideal society. The ideal society, of course, is one based on virtues and human beings pursuing um, the good, everything leading towards a virtuous road. And Plato believed that the people best suited as benevolent rulers of society to guide society through the state were people like him, intellectuals. Um, Now, Plato did not like democracy. He didn't like oligarchy. He didn't like democracy. These are forms of government that existed before in Athens. He didn't like any form of government that existed up to that time. No form. So he created the utopian vision, this ideal society of the philosopher king. Now, democracy in Athens was not exactly egalitarian. Athenians were not egalitarian by any stretch of the imagination. Um, Democracy literally means ruled by the people. The question is which people? Because Jean Locke, the great philosopher in England in the 17th century, uses that exact same term, people. And then you wonder, what people is he talking about? He talks about people should determine the fate of the government, the form of government, which people. And then when you study more, you figure out, he means those people. In in part two, I discuss luck. In this part, and you find out what people he meant, the capitalist class. Plato meant in democracy, rather. Sorry, in democracy, the Greeks, the Athenians in the 5th century had a system where all the women were excluded, all the slaves were excluded, all the non-Athenian citizens were excluded. They were called metics in classical Greek, foreigners, in other words, although they could have been from the next city state, neighboring city state. all women, right? No women, no slaves, no metics, adult males only. But there was a trick here. Adult males only could participate in the assembly down in the Parthenon, up in the Parthenon, I should say, it's a hill in the center of Athens. And they could participate voluntarily to represent themselves. Democracy in Athens was not a representative democracy like, for example, the United States or France, or any modern democracy. It wasn't representative. It was direct or radical democracy. Citizens represented themselves. Now, for a citizen to take off work, say you're an adult male and you're a citizen, you qualify to take off work and to go up to the Parthenon to take part in the assembly. That means your work is going to lag behind. You have to be able to afford it. So invariably, it was indeed the wealthier people, because there's another element to it. Let's say you did. Somehow you managed to go up to the Parthenon, you take part in the assembly and so forth. Okay. Now what? You have to get up and speak. They had to be articulate. That means you had to have, even if you wanted to, you had to have an education to get up and articulate and know what the issues were and be able to articulate policy, because they were brutal in the assembly toward people who were not articulate. Now, how do you get an education? You have to buy. There was no public education, private. You have to have a private tutor. So we're left with, again, the wealthy, large landowners and the commercial class in Athens composing what is called democracy. This is the democracy that existed. No egalitarianism, no equality. You can't have democracy when you exclude women, you exclude slaves, you exclude foreigners. That's not democracy. Now, Plato didn't believe in that, nor did he believe in the equality of the free citizen with a slave. He believed that slavery was natural. He just took it for granted. Like all the ancient Greeks, as we'll see, Aristotle, Plato's student, Aristotle, believed the same thing. Plato, there is a story, some controversy to the story, by the way, was caught by pirates and was going to be sold. He was recognized to a slave market. They have slave markets throughout the Mediterranean world. He was going to be sold. He was recognized and freed. Someone recognized him and they freed him. Despite that experience, he still maintains this position, although he knew that slavery was a man-made institution. In the ancient world, by the way, slaves, how were slaves, how did someone become a slave? Throughout the ancient world, falling into debt was one way, prisoner of war was another way. Okay, debt and war. So and of course the children of slaves. So you have a human institution, a manufactured institution, for profit, for money, and Plato knew that as much as his pupil Aristotle. Yet they argued this was natural. This is how it is. Anyway, let me move on to Aristotle. Aristotle comes after Plato. He did not agree with Plato's idealism. He did not agree with much with Plato on women. Aristotle actually was much more brutal toward women. He believed they were psychologically and biologically inferior and flawed by nature, that somehow nature made a mistake in creating women the way nature created women. This is to the extent he took it. No equality there. He also believed, although by the way, he was much more practical individual, not a nobleman like Plato, much more practical in his thinking, and a towering intellectual, by the way, that the West obviously to this day, graduate schools and undergraduate schools throughout the world study Aristotle as well as Plato. Um, this is an individual who did not believe in equality and believed that inequality was natural, just like Plato did. So elitism and hierarchies are part of the mind thought of the mind of these two towering intellectuals who really more represented the status quo than anything else. They didn't challenge the status quo. They knew how slavery was created, why a slave was a slave. They knew, but they didn't challenge the status quo. They simply provided justifications on why that's how it should be. Okay, and I regret to say that we have uh, theologians from St. Augustine to Martin Luther doing the exact same thing in Western Christendom. Okay? So it's not just the pagan philosophers of Greece. By the way, the Greeks passed on this mindset to the Romans. Okay? The Romans uh, absorbed much of classical Greek civilization. And the Greeks also passed much of their classical civilization to the through the Macedonians, because Aristotle was the teacher of Alexander the Great, and Alexander the Great created a huge empire going throughout and from Africa, from North Africa throughout much of Asia, all the way to India. And so what you have is this Greek culture being um, uh, spread throughout other regions. One of the biggest libraries in the ancient world was in Egypt, in a city named after Alexander the Great, namely in Alexandria. By the way, the Arabs preserved some of this knowledge, and thanks to them, years later, when they were in contact with, through the Iberian Peninsula, when they conquered the Iberian Peninsula, that is Spain, they passed on that knowledge to the West, to Western Christendom. Let me move on to, um, since I mentioned Western Christendom, let me move on to Christianity. Christianity is influenced by the church fathers, especially by St. Paul and St. Augustine. And I want to talk about those two a little bit because they were very important. Both St. Paul and St. Augustine had one thing in common: they loved Plato. So they accepted Platonism and injected Platonism into Christianity, into Christian dogma, Christian doctrine. So what you have is, by the way, one of the things when I took a course with a very gentle professor who was in Chicago. He had studied in Europe and taught at the University of Chicago, and then came where I was. And he a course on world religions, and he insisted that if you take Greek philosophy out of Christianity, out of Christian doctrine, you don't have much left. You have Judaism. Um, there is enormous classical Greek thought injected into this religion, which means that, which, by the way, Greek thought that was pagan. Let's not forget that the classical Greek philosophers were not Christians, they were pagans. This is before the rise of Christianity, which coincides with the reign of Augustus Caesar. This is long before that. In any case, Saint Paul and Saint Augustine, both Platonists. Saint Paul did not had the view that the Christian view that's universal and from the early church fathers all the way to theologians in the modern period, that there must be spiritual egalitarianism. That is, we're all the children of God. All of us are the children of God. Okay. What does that mean? At the spiritual level, we're equal. We were all created by God. Although women a little bit less so because of the fall in the Adam and Eve story. Namely, Eve was the catalyst for the exodus from the Garden of Eden because Eve persuaded Adam to partake of the apple. Let me explain, by the way, this story of the Garden of Eden and the apple, because another course that I took in, I think it was in ethics, and my professor was an existentialist Christian, and he had a very interesting, and I love the explanation then. The violation of the will of God is sin. Eating the apple was just symbolic. God said to man, have all of this, it's yours, not that tree over there. Man violated the will of his own creator, proving that there is a sense of selfishness or atomism, if you will, in human beings. And the Christian church fathers blame Eve more than they did Adam. And the woman in the Abrahamic religions, but especially in Christianity, a little bit less so in Islam, the woman becomes the focus of evil. So what we have is Saint Paul and Saint Augustine accepting spiritual egalitarianism, but not material socioeconomic egalitarianism. They did not want to deal with the social status quo, the political status quo, the economic status quo. Saint Augustine became famous because in 426 he wrote the great work on which I did my master thesis in my previous life, called The City of God. The City of God was his monumental work where he explained that there are two cities, the city of man, the Roman Empire, which was falling, by the way, in the 5th century, during the life of St. Augustine. St. Augustine, by the way, was a pagan. Late in life, he converted. I believe he was from Algeria, North Africa. Late in life, he converted to Christianity, becomes a bishop. And he was a prolific writer and a very talented writer. Profoundly influenced by Plato, influenced by St. Paul. And St. Augustine, in writing The City of God, argues that there is only one city that is forever eternal, the city of God, paradise, right? This city is flawed. It's the city of sin. So he wasn't concerned with that. So he was not going to address issues about equality in this city. The only thing that mattered was the next one. So that's what he focused on. St. Augustine um, influenced all of Christian thinking up until the time of St. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, by the way. The early church in the Western Christendom was the Church of St. Augustine. St. Augustine was the pillar of the church, the theologian that the church followed. Until St. Thomas Aquinas comes along in the 13th century, who was an Aristotelian. Obviously his claim to fame, as we say, is that he injected Aristotle's thought into um, Christianity. He merged Christianity with Aristotelian philosophy. Again, what we see here is the two towering medieval theologians merging pagan philosophy with Christian doctrine and accepting inequality of the sexes, that is the patriarchal society. Both St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas both believe in the patriarchal society. This is one reason that years ago there was an American scholar, her name is Mary Daly, who wrote a book called Beyond God the Father. And the book was about this period where the God was a male symbol, a male figure, and everyone had to worship this male figure. Women were subservient to the male figure. And women in reality, by the way, in everyday society throughout the Middle Ages, their faith rested on the father, the brother, if there was no father, the husband. Women were not, did not have the sense of autonomy that they have in the post-industrial period. Okay. And this is an issue of egalitarianism. The other group, of course, that suffers, and we have the vast majority of the population here, and these theologians did not address this, are the people in the farms, the serfs, especially in the time of in the time of Saint Thomas Aquinas. Um, Saint Augustine knew that the vast majority worked in the farms. They did not address the people working and exploited because they were interested in saving the soul, not saving the livelihood, the body, saving the having, making sure that the state had policies that allowed for social development. That was an issue. Social justice for this life was not an issue. Spiritual justice was an issue, not social justice here. Now, I should tell you, by the way, since I mentioned St. Augustine and Christianity and Thomas Aquinas, that just for the sake of contrast, Confucianism, Hinduism, and Islam are not that different. All three were patriarchal. All three dealt with, especially, let me take one by one. Let me take Hinduism first. Hinduism did advocate the oneness of all creation and the quest of the individual to achieve spiritual transcendence and unity with that oneness. The fact is that under Hinduism, then and today, there were caste systems. The fact is that under Hinduism, there was massive exploitation of the majority of the people in the farms, as there is today, by the way, under Prime Minister Modi, over as the farm demonstrations have showed in the last 5 years. So we have a, a religious justification for poverty. Now, Hinduism did believe in spiritual equality and did not believe in the exploitation of human beings, and they did believe in giving alms, supporting, in other words, the poor, and did not and abhorred poverty. On the other hand, they advised people that if they were poor, they should not lament it, they should just embrace poverty, which is an interesting thing to say, by the way, to someone who is poor, and to focus on spiritual transcendence. Okay. And those of you who have studied Hinduism and have seen and have been to India and have studied some Hindu practices and so forth, and you've seen individuals who are so devout that they renounce the body and they devote themselves to spiritual contemplation, you feel, oh, maybe there's something to it. However, the reality is that the average person, the majority of the population, on a daily basis, their goal, as Charles Darwin pointed out, is survival and to perpetuate their species. Okay? Spiritual quest aside, that's the daily grind. That's the daily grind. Um, Hinduism was also patriarchal, by the way. It remains so. Confucianism, even more so. Confucianism is not exactly a religion. It was a system that supported hierarchy for the sake of order in society. And of course, Confucianism has a far reaching impact in the history of China for the last 1500 years. Huge impact in Chinese culture, in the way the bureaucracies operate, the way society was organized and government. So we have, in fact, a model here which focuses on morality and duty. However, a patriarchal model that does not question inequality. In fact, it accepts inequality on the basis of social class. So this is no different than what, when you look at on a world scale, world religions, you don't see much difference here. Islam, when the Prophet Muhammad comes along, inherits these tribal religions, polytheistic. People were polytheistic before the Prophet Muhammad. He unified the people behind Islam, provided the people with guidelines, rationalized the relationship of men with women, tried to bring greater respect for women, especially the mother, by the way. So in Islam, we have some level of improvement in comparison with the other religions, much more in comparison with the polytheistic practices before the Prophet Muhammad. Okay, so that's a certainty. And then we also see that the relationship, that there is a great respect, and there is respect, by the way, this is very important. Islam respected the Abrahamic faiths, in other words, Judaism and Christianity, did not discriminate on the basis of that, nor did Islam discriminate on the basis of ethnicity. For example, whether people of any color or any ethnicity did not discriminate, accepted people on the basis of faith, as people of the book, in other words, of this derived um, from Judaism, from Abraham. So you have basically a more rational approach on how, and tolerance, much more tolerance than you do on the part of Christians, by the way, toward the Muslims and toward Jews. Christians were not tolerant, um, especially from the Black Death on. There is less and less tolerance. From the outbreak of the Black Death, that many Christians blamed um, roaming gypsies and Jews. Onwards, you have basically a situation where uh, Christians become less tolerant, especially since the Crusades had already taken place to take the trade routes using the pretext of securing Jerusalem for the papacy, by the way. Now, let me go on to skip all of this and come on to Machiavelli and then Martin Luther and ended with Martin Luther. Thomas More, I have to mention Thomas More. Machiavelli, Thomas More, and then Luther. Uh, the During the Renaissance, as the Middle Ages was phased out, and there was a rise of trade, especially with Italian merchants and banking families making headway in Europe. Um, there was no Italy, by the way. There was, I should say, just for the record, in case people assume there was, Italy was created as a nation state in 1860. There was no Italy. There were Italian states, city states, like ancient Greek city states. So Italy was actually carved up into various states. Now, the Renaissance is really centered in northern Italy, but it's eventually spreads throughout Europe. Eventually, it spreads throughout Europe. The Renaissance, it's not surprising that they centered in the Renaissance. The Italian merchants had contact with the Middle East. They had contact with the Byzantines, the Greek Orthodox in what is today Istanbul. Used to be Constantinople. That was the Byzantine. The Ottoman Empire was the Byzantine Empire before it fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. So so what we have is this brilliant Italian political thinker called Niccolo Machiavelli emerging in the 15th century in Italy, and he provides in the work The Prince this overview of what, not how the government ought to be, not an idealistic version like Plato, the utopia of the Republic, but rather a very cynical view. And this is very important, because what he does is he looks at human nature. He looks at how human beings are. If this is how they are, then this is the best form of government. The assumptions he makes about how we are, what our nature is like, are rooted in the dark side of Christian assumptions. He believed that all of us are born with a seed of evil, that we are in fact predisposed to doing bad, not to doing the right thing. That human beings are devious. Human beings who cheat, lie, steal, manipulate. So how can there be equality and no exploitation if this is how human beings are? So he attributed natural forces into the fact that that inequality and exploitation are actually institutionalized. He said, no, it's human beings. That's how they are. Therefore, he argued, the form of government you need is one that's a strong authoritarian regime, the prince, the authoritarian figure. An English philosopher named Thomas Hobbes comes along in the 17th century, in the aftermath of the English Civil War, and more or less follows along the same lines. Thomas Hobbes accepts some of the same cynical views about how we are as human beings, that we don't have positive traits, that we're born, if you will, with a seed of evil. You can argue that if you grow up in a Christian world and that's ingrained into your head because of the fall of Adam and Eve, and your quest in life, your whole quest in life is to find a way to secure paradise because you're evil and you're predisposed to evil and you're going to do evil deeds, then I guess it's easy to arrive at these assumptions. So Thomas Hobbes also believed that if that's how human beings are, and he lived through the Civil War, by the way, when hundreds of thousands of people were slaughtered in England. So the Civil War was between those who supported the Stuart dynasty, that many regarded tyrannical and tried to get rid of it, and those who, obviously, those who opposed it and those who supported it. And it was a bloody affair. And Thomas Hobbes comes along and says, well, you really need a government that regiments human beings, an authoritarian government to put order into society. Order. Order means that the government will dictate who is regimented and who benefits. And clearly, that's the issue about egalitarianism and exploitation. Now, another Englishman before Thomas Hobbes, Sir Thomas More, comes along in the early 16th century, and he argued that society is becoming more unequal. Now, he wrote a book called Utopia. He was right out front with this. No missing of words. Now, Thomas More accepted, unfortunately, the Christian assumptions of gender inequality, that women were inferior. He accepted that. He was alarmed, however, in the early 16th century, in the transition from subsistence agriculture to commercial agriculture and the rise of commercial capitalism. He was alarmed at the rise of exploitation of workers, a new working class. So he wrote Utopia, and it's a very visionary work, and it influenced, by the way, generations of thinkers all the way up to the 19th century socialists, who many believe, by the way, that Thomas More, as a Christian egalitarian, was in fact a precursor to socialism and, in fact, communism, if you will. A contemporary of Thomas More was Martin Luther, a German theologian. He's the last one we'll discuss in part one, and then there's part two that takes us all the way to neoliberalism. Martin Luther was appalled. But he came from from lower middle class family background. Let me just point that out. He was educated. I believe his father, yes, I remember, his father wanted him to be a lawyer, And he was disappointed that the young man went off to school and he chose not to be a lawyer. He chose theology, and he chose the teaching profession. He became a university professor. He was also a monk, by the way. Young man Luther was rebellious. He was rebellious. I believe Eric Fromm has written a book, The Psychologist, entitled Young Man Luther, which is a fascinating. I remember I was reading it when I took a course with a German professor on Martin Luther. And I was fascinated with Martin Luther. A lot of people, when they first read Martin Luther, they're just fascinated. Oh, 500 years ago, he wrote his famous 95 Thesis, among other works, challenging the Catholic Church, the Catholic establishment. It was really very hard-hitting stuff. Martin Luther was appalled that the church was selling for cash remission of sins through a model called indulgences. Indulgences was a way to buy someone remission of sins. You want remission of sins? Give me the cash. He was also appalled that the church, by the way, this is a reality, the Catholic Church, Western Christendom, was the largest landowning institution, the richest in all of Europe. Okay? In the modern period, the Vatican had its own bank, Banco Ambrosiano, it's called, its own bank. The fact is, there has historically been corruption linked with the Catholic Church. This I'm not saying anything that everybody doesn't, that people don't know, including Catholic. Actually, more Catholics know about this than non-Catholics. Uh, Luther was the first to go out in public with this. He actually traveled to Rome and he saw how they lived, how the upper clergy lived, from the Pope down to the cardinals, the archbishops, the bishops. He was appalled at how materialistic they are. These are the people who called for spiritual equality, and they were the elite of society. They were the way up at the top with the nobility, while they had, by the way, serfs working for them and serving them. So the inequality was right inside the institution that was preaching spiritual inequality, spiritual equality rather. So what we have with Luther is he was concerned about the corruption of the church. He wanted to go back to the origin of the church, the Christian church, the way that the apostles Jesus Christ intended it, as a pure institution, obviously. That was the goal, needless to say. The hierarchy and the elitism that he wanted to eliminate was not eliminated in the Lutheran Church. The degree of corruption is another issue, but that's another point. Martin Luther was not interested. By the way, he did not believe that women were equal. He also did not believe that human beings were equal in secular society, nor did he care. He could care less if they were unequal, if there was exploitation. He didn't care if German merchants were exploiting workers, mining workers or dock workers, or lords were exploiting the peasants in the fields. In fact, when a rebellion broke out from Germany to Switzerland to Austria, along the border down with France in that Alsace-Lorraine region, a Central European-wide rebellion called the German Peasants' War in 1524. When that broke out, Luther sided with the nobility, and he asked the church and the nobility to come together and cut off the heads of the rebels. That's what they did. I discussed this in part 2 of this segment on inequality and exploitation. I want to summarize today's session by telling you that philosophers and theologians merely reflect inequality and exploitation from which the elites benefit. In other words, they're the modern day television, if you will, modern day media. Um, they did not necessarily, rarely did they question the status quo. Sir Thomas More questioned the status quo within reason. As we'll see in the next section, is those of you who see the part two, you will see that Thomas Munzer certainly did. He was executed for it, but he did question the status quo. He did question inequality and exploitation. He called it what it was. It was there for everyone to see. There's no point sugarcoating exploitation. It's obvious. People know what it is. Whether it was 500 years ago in the time of Martin Luther or today, they know what it is because they live it, they experience it. But major thinkers from Plato and Aristotle, St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, Niccolo Machiavelli, Martin Luther, major thinkers throughout the Western world. And we just briefly, from an overview perspective, I mentioned Confucianism, Hinduism, Islam. The fact is, we see that these institutions also did not meddle with the status quo. If anything, by the way, these people justified the inequality and exploitation of the status quo to some degree. This is not to say that they don't, all of them, all of these religions, Islam, Christianity, Judaism, they don't ask people to give to the poor. And even Plato, by the way, lamented extremes. He lamented too much poverty and too much concentrated wealth. He said that's bad for society. That brings disharmony, discord, social chaos. He was wise enough, by the way, to recognize that because he knew that. He lived in Athens. So they knew, people knew, as they, in spite of their sense to defend the status quo and to basically, through their ideas, justify and validate conformity to inequality and exploitation, which, by the way, I should point out, for religion, inequality and exploitation is, and it ought to be, a moral issue. But the question is, should it be limited to the spiritual domain? Let the slave be a slave, because let's face it, when Sir Thomas More and Martin Luther were writing, there was the beginning of the rise of the transatlantic slave trade. Western Europeans were bringing thousands of Africans across the Atlantic Ocean, taking them to the Western Hemisphere, the United States, and down to Latin America, especially Brazil, but also the Caribbean, to become slaves, workers, for free. Enslaving a human being, by the way, was even justified by the church, because they were not Christians, right? So they knew exactly what was happening here, but the Eurocentric ideology, the Eurocentric values, and the value system, which is passed on, by the way, they are passed on and reach their height in the late 19th century with social Darwinism. And to some degree, you can see it to this day with the far right wing in Europe, here in Europe, whose target is the non-white Asian and African migrant. Okay? Thank you very much for listening. I appreciate it. By all means, send your comments. Watch part two as well. It is the second part of this, and it brings a conclusion to this. Thank you very much. Bye bye.